Kia ora koutou katoa. We want to acknowledge the people of Rangitane, the ancestors, the owners of this land, who invite us to continually imagine and interrogate the processes of decolonization that we participate in and that lie ahead of us in this journey, both within academe and in our academic activist interventions. We have had the pleasure of having with us the activist Anjum Rahman for this week. And it's been such a joy conversing and collaborating with you, Anjum.
Thanks.
So we have been working on this white paper that we are going to share with you. Over to you, Anjum.
Oh, tēnā koutou katoa. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this program. And I found it to be a really great opportunity to put all together in one place some of the thoughts that I've had around the work that I've been doing in the space of online harm. Obviously, I'm not a researcher, and so activist in residence is an appropriate title for me because a lot of it is activism around policy, around change, around awareness and education. And so I feel that, the white paper is a culmination of that and the ability to put all of these differing thoughts and ideas in one place and to back it up with the evidence that's available has been a really helpful process for me. And I hope that the paper is also helpful for others, both who are just new to the space, but also who have a good understanding to provide, a sort of logical and sequence step around this.
Great. So here's how we have set up the paper. We are going to begin by defining what is online warfare and what we mean by it. Then we are going to unpack a little bit the communicative strategies underlying online warfare and looking at the modes and infrastructures of communication. And finally, we will wrap up by looking at some strategies for countering online warfare. So the way in which we have set up this conversation is in direct response to Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is promoting peace, justice, and strong institutions. If you look at the language of the SDGs, there is a very specific focus given here to promoting inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So we hope that when we speak to SDG 16, we are able to map out the ways in which online warfare generates substantive challenges to this sustainable development goal, and how do we go about addressing it.
Cool. So the reason that we've used the term online warfare is because what is happening online is well organized. It uses particular tactics. So this is not just organic. This is not just people sitting in their homes and randomly deciding to do these things. That also happens. But what we're talking about in this space is resourced, coordinated activity, sometimes carried out by states, sometimes carried out by other actors. And so there's a lot of reasons why this is happening. So did you want to add anything before I go through those?
Yeah, but I mean, I think we sort of outline a few features of online warfare, right? One is spreading disinformation and hate, particularly looking at the ways in which disinformation and hate are connected to each other. The next part is threatening social cohesion. Then talking about the ways in which that threatens democratic processes, all the way from internal processes of democracies, voter suppression, to foreign interference in democratic processes, to attacking justice-based mobilizations emergent from marginalized communities. We are particularly concerned in the ways in which marginalized communities are turned into targets of online warfare. And then the ways in which this draws into the deployment of violence, Anjum, right? That results in marginalized communities experiencing effects of that violence. I just want to also hold up a concept that runs through our presentation, which is the concept of the margins of the margins. This is a concept that emerges from the culture-centered approach and that argues that within marginalized contexts, there remain inequities such that there are intersectional spaces within marginalized communities where the effects of hate and violence are further exacerbated because of the intersections. And we want to particularly attend to those spaces and sites.
Cool.
Mohan, is this a global project or do you have a particular country in mind?
So what we will present is a global context, but as you will see, we will directly connect to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and demonstrate why this is a concern here.
So some of the reasons for why these online warfare tactics are being used, first of all, it's silencing. So from a state perspective, it can be about silencing dissent, political dissent. For other hate mongers, it's about silencing the types of people they don't like. So you see from incel culture and so on, they want to silence the voice of women, particularly prominent women. They want to reduce the number of women standing for elected office, and so on. So other different groups are targeted in this way. But at its heart, these tactics are about removing free speech rights of marginalized groups. And then the second aim is disrupting democracy. So, we think about the end of the Cold War, and this is kind of the new front of how states are disrupting political processes and democratic processes in each other's countries. And there is plenty of evidence available online around states conducting this kind of activity. Another group of actors in the space, and sometimes it's also states, but organizations and individuals are using these tactics to generate large amounts of income. So they're using advertising mechanisms through various platforms. They're using the sale of merchandise and books and lecture tours and so on to generate wealth that has been really significant. These tactics also have been used to gain political clout and power. So we see more and more extreme actors getting into government through the use of these kinds of tactics that target marginalized communities. And so it gives them the ability to create this enemy and try to mobilize the majority population and make them feel under threat by this enemy and thereby gain widespread support and then move into power. And finally, what we're seeing, and we have seen, and it's certainly not a new tactic, I think it's more that it's exacerbated online, is that saying or writing or posting content that is incredibly inflammatory, designed to garner outrage, gives them a whole lot of free advertising and publicity. It gives them virality of their content. As people get outraged, they comment on the post, which gives it hundreds and maybe thousands of comments. They share it to say, look how awful this person is, and to refute the content. They hit, an angry emoji reaction and so on. All of this creates a viral spread of content and gives literally millions and millions of dollars of free advertising. So those are just some of the purposes why this activity occurs.
So, Anjum, something that you're highlighting here is that there is a political economy of hate, if you will. So there is an underlying capitalist structure that profits from hate, but there's also an underlying political structure that is funded by this capitalist structure that profits from hate. Hate is a profitable business, if you will.
Very much so.
Yes, let's get into the communicative strategies of online warfare. And let's begin with the one that we are most familiar with, which is disinformation, which is actually usage of information that is incorrect or untrue or misleading, but driven by a strategic purpose. So the producer and the disseminator of disinformation is well aware that the information is incorrect, but it is spread precisely to deceive your target audience. You have seen this with COVID-19 conspiracy theories, for instance, and often, one of the things that the literature points to is how COVID-19 conspiracies were often directed at marginalized communities. So here in Aotearoa, for instance, consider the targeting of Maori and Pacifica communities with COVID-19 disinformation. So these conspiracy theories, in that sense, have a very specific purpose embedded within a racist ideology. And you think about the goal of that ideology then in terms of vaccine access or inaccess. Similarly, consider the ways in which disinformation is spread, targeted at marginalized communities to suppress their participation in voting processes. We have seen this in the US with the 2016 elections, where African American communities were targeted with the messaging, and this were largely coming from a Russian internet agency. African American communities being targeted with the message, don't get out and vote. And that kind of voter suppression then is directly connected to uh, interfering into democratic processes. So producers of disinformation actively construct inaccurate information with specific objective of misguiding the target audience and with the goal of impacting knowledge, attitude, and behavior of the target audience based upon the inaccurate information. Uh, the next concept is communicative inversion. So we have done quite a bit of work here at CARE on this concept of communicative inversion. The concept simply refers to the uses of communication tropes and symbols to turn materiality on its head. So where you see communicative inversion often being carried out is where majority communities construct minority communities as the danger or as the threat, and then pose the conversation around the ways in which these minority community threats can be addressed. Now, this is often then deployed as a strategy to produce anxiety, to produce fear toward the minority, and then to call for violence. We have seen this within the context of conspiracies such as the Great Replacement Theory that makes the argument that the white culture is under threat. And that conspiracy is often deployed toward various strategies for mobilizing violence. And we see that narrative play out in a number of um, uh, white extremist terror attacks. So,
Can I add a local example of where, for example, Maori communities have, some of the worst statistics around being underprivileged, and yet the framing when there are policies to reduce those inequities is that these people are being privileged, and creating that notion of, oh, they're getting something that we don't have, without any recognition of the need that's there and the racism that has underpinned those inequities.
That's a perfect example of communicative inversion, Anjum. So I would think the slogan, for instance, equality for all, it is made to appear that it is an invitation to equality, but it is fundamentally a racist narrative that undermines and unsees questions of equity and the empirical evidence, the resounding empirical evidence on inequities in health outcomes that, as once again, as social science research has consistently pointed out, are driven by structural determinants such as colonialism. There is no doubt about that in the literature. And I guess this is why the social sciences are in attack as well, right? Because for these white supremacists, they would rather that we don't speak and we don't talk about our research and these structural determinants of health. Another example with respect to that I wanted to give, Anjum, is this narrative around uh, co-governance as apartheid, or this narrative of this being apartheid as we are turning toward teterity. That again is an example of a communicative inversion in the
That's right.
sense that it takes the fundamental commitments of teterity and turns them on its head to say that that's a threat to democracy.
Yeah, and that the very racism that was used to deny those rights guaranteed in the treaty being inverted to say actually upholding te tiriti is racist in itself. So it's a very common tactic.
Yeah. And of course, in a lot of our work on Hindutva,
Mm.
we have seen this consistently being used. This narrative of Hindu khatre mein hai, or the Hindu is in danger, is the war cry of Hindutva groups mobilized to carry out violence on Muslims in India. But also, unfortunately, we are starting to see that across the Indian diaspora.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about framing?
No, I'll jump in from here.
Okay.
You carry on.
Okay. So the next set of communicative devices we want to talk about is framing. Frames offer us ways of looking at the world. They offer us ways of looking at issues, looking at people, looking at communities. Now, in strategies of online disinformation and hate, the frame that you will see continually being reproduced is one of the others. So consider, for instance, the frame of the Islamic invader that you see in Hindutva discourses in India or in far-right neo-Nazi discourses in Europe. And this is where, in a lot of our work, we see the intersection between far-right Zionist discourses, Hindutva discourses, and white supremacist discourses talking about the Muslim takeover. So the frame of the other then is directly tied to the narrative of the cultural loss. Consider, for instance, the ways in which white supremacists construct this notion of a pure culture of the past that is being taken over by migrants. Consider, for instance, the ways in which conspiracy theories were circulated around the UN Migration Compact, and that were then deployed to call for various forms of violence directed at migrants. Consider the ways in which the love jihad or revolution through love narrative or the groomer gang narrative are being deployed across Europe in targeting various Muslim migrant and refugee communities. So these are all examples that demonstrate the ways in which this process of othering in framing devices shapes the deployment and mobilization of hate. Connected to this, then, or building from this, is the process of dehumanization. So, dehumanization takes away human characteristics out of a human being and constructs the target group as deprived of human quality. So, you see,
So you see words like cockroach, vermin, and these kinds of words used to dehumanize. You also often see the use of pronouns such as it, rather than he, she, they, them, it to dehumanize. And that's a key characteristic of the person using dehumanizing speech to really target a group.
Yep. And Anjum, one of the things that research consistently points out is that dehumanization lies at the core of calls to genocide, which then result in genocide. If you look at the steps of genocide, and one of the things I've noticed here in Aotearoa within the context of the current election cycle is dehumanizing narratives that compare migrants to cancer, for instance.
Yes.
Or some kind of malignancy or a disease. These are narratives that actually lie at the heart of mobilization of hate and violence.
And I'd just like to acknowledge the work of organizations like the Dangerous Speech Project, the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, and others who have been really highlighting the way this kind of language is used and the harm that it causes.
Yes. One of the things we have seen again in our work on Hindutva in India is the proliferation of dehumanization discourse to extreme levels, where, we look at a survey that, CARE had completed in December 22. And it's a survey with Muslims and their experiences of hate on online platforms. And in a sample size of 1,000 participants, 60% plus of the participants were saying that they were exposed to dehumanizing discourse, being called or compared to animals, or being described in terms comparing to animals. Now, alongside dehumanization and framing as the other is a strategy of equivocation. So those that produce and disseminate hate speech often draw upon equivocation in order to deny. So there is the plausible deniability. So one of the things that we see often is when a community is dehumanized, simultaneously there is language that says, okay, it is this broader culture that promotes peace. It is that culture that is being threatened. Or when migrants are being shown as the other that are going to take over our democracy, what is positioned in contrast to that is, oh, I'm just promoting democracy and calling for people to participate in democracy.
Or they're going to take our jobs, and so you're protecting economic security. And often the thing is that a lot of the issues that are being brought forward are real and valid issues, but the drivers of it is often state policies or the prevailing culture, rather than the marginalized community who's having to work within those structures and are as much victims of those structures, but are presented as the cause and the reason for those harms.
One of the sort of contemporary sites of extreme hate that has been documented by the Disinformation Project that we are seeing in our work is the hate targeted toward transgender women specifically. And here consider, equivocation in terms of faith-based organizations that portray images of family, dialogue, and harmony. So you see these advertisements that are calling for, oh, let's safeguard the family. But underlying that is the call toward hate, is a call toward violence directed at transgender women. So think about the ways in which queer story hours have been targeted globally and have become sites of violence. Consider the ways in which this family discourse works alongside the promotion of messages such as the queer community is a source of threat to our children and our children's well-being, and that is then mobilized toward various forms of violence.
And the family is also used often to embed misogyny and to reduce the freedom of women. So then attack on single women as parents has been historically, widespread in an attempt to keep women in situations that are actually harmful, oppressive, and abusive. And also, around reproductive rights being seen as an attack on families, an attack on children. So there are various ways that that these framings are used to cover what is actually some really repressive policies. And when we look at some of the policies coming through in the States and the United States, you can see the impacts of this kind of equivocation.
And thank you, Anjum, for pointing out sort of the policy context of this, because the policy context of the US demonstrates to you the nature of the mainstreaming of far-right hate. Because what you really have today within the context of US with respect to the policy-based attacks on abortion rights, or policy-based attacks on rights of transgender the communities to health and healthcare, demonstrate what happens when far-right rhetoric, mediatized through in this context, Christian nationalist groups become then architectures for policy making.
Yeah, yeah.
Anjum, you're pointing me to time, so we
Yeah,
need to
because I want to
keep going.
spend time on the recommendations.
Yes. So the next point is humor and plausible deniability. Humor is often deployed as a strategy for generating hate, and it signals or it points toward calls for hate or calls for violence, while then turning to the narrative that, oh, I was just joking. And this can really work toward mobilizing larger swarms toward participating in hate. The next point, you want to add anything to that?
No.
The next point I want to make is the strategy of impersonation, where fake websites, fake social media accounts impersonating the targeted person or targeted community are put up in order to mobilize hate and call for hate. Now, one of the things that we see consistently in the targeting of activists, researchers, academics is the ways in which impersonation is used, and often with impunity, simply because of the nature of global capital that is unregulated, often drawing upon free speech discourses to be unregulated.
And then also a part of impersonation is that someone from within that extremist group will pretend to be a person of the minority group. And there are many, many instances that are of this happening, and saying things that will inflame and create that hatred, and then, through sock puppet accounts or through coordinated activity, say, look, see, this is what target group does. This proves that we are right. This proves they're a threat, when actually it's one of their own people behind that account.
Anjum, I know that we are short of time, but I'm just quickly going to add, within the context of Hindutva in India, for instance, we have seen how Hindutva-aligned actors have created apps like the Bully Bhai app, where they created the app and they took images of Muslim activists, politicians, academics across the country, and then put them up for auctioning on the app. That's an example of sort of the extreme nature of this violence.
And it was particularly women, and there was really a sexual harassment aspect to the app as well. So I'm going to move on to some further tactics here. So death and rape threats are absolutely a tactic for silencing. The vilest language, and we see language that gives dates and times of when the person is going to commit this atrocity. They will communicate the ways that the murder will happen or the rape will happen in really very explicit language. And then there's the volume of this. And so all intended to remove and to try and make people delete their accounts and remove their voice. It's also a common tactic to target the livelihoods of activists, so to contact and have multiple mass complaints to their employer, with the hope that they will lose any kind of economic stability and thereby also lose their voice. And, we had the example of Byron Clark being visited in his workplace by one of these white supremacists, with the result that he did eventually lose his job. So it has been an effective strategy. In terms of mimicking research and accountability, so you will see websites with the name research in the heading and so on. And for example, I was referred to a website that purportedly had research that showed that masking was a waste of time, no need to mask, and it looked very legitimate. So when I did a fact check on the website, so rather than fact checking the content, I fact checked the website, and then the fact checkers, it came up there as this is a site that is known to produce fake information, disinformation, as well as the fact that it's anonymous. So, so it looks real, but when you try and find who's the person behind it, they don't have anybody's name anywhere on the site. we also see that particularly Russian disinformation has set up websites looking like legitimate media websites, and that mainstream media has been fooled by some of these and reported stories from those sites as if they were real. Doxing is the practice of publishing the home and work address, the email address, and personal phone numbers and work numbers of their target. And so this is a tactic that sits alongside the death and rape threats. And so often it will, the threat will be with a picture of your house. Here's your address. I know where you live. This is what I'm going to do to you. Or if they don't send that themselves, they put that information online and encourage their followers to contact this person. So then there's a swarm of harassment and feeling very unsafe, victims having to leave their homes, cancel public lectures, delete their accounts, all of this part of the silencing. And so that leads into the next area, which is the volume. So often the tactic that's used creates such a volume that it is overwhelming, and it is not possible to refute each and every comment. And so that anyone who's reading that account and the comments under it gets a very unbalanced view, because the person themselves, because often they're marginalised, doesn't have the same networks to create the volume of response that they're getting. So that reduces their effectiveness and it reduces their voice. Did you want to cover intertextuality?
Yeah, briefly. So intertextuality refers to the ways in which diverse hate actors and hate groups communicate with each other, draw upon each other in order to target communities at the margins, and further through that process then exacerbate, magnify, and multiply the hate. One of the examples that I pointed to earlier is the intersection between white supremacist and Hindutva hate. We see in our research, for instance, the ways in which far-right accounts out of India, such as Op India, Nupur J. Sharma, intersect with far-right accounts out of Europe, such as Tommy J. Robinson, aligned with the Proud Boys, which then intersect with far-right Hindutva accounts out of Australia that have been targeting academics and activists here in Aotearoa. So you see the network and the ecosystem and how they pick up on each other. So intertextuality is really critical in terms of amplifying the volume that you're referring to, Anjum. And the next point that I will make is about hate as free speech. And here I will read out what we wrote, because that will get the message out, I think, where we argue that various forms of hate discourses often draw upon the articulation of free speech to build and sustain the infrastructures for producing and disseminating hate. Particularly salient here is the role of white supremacist groups in settler colonies to draw upon free speech frameworks to legitimize the production and circulation of hate, targeting indigenous communities, migrants, gender diverse communities, and other communities at intersectional margins. The framing of free speech as an infrastructure for legitimizing hate reflects the fundamental hypocrisy of whiteness as the organizing ideology in settler colonies. So we want to really point to this kind of communicative inversion.
Can I just add the hypocrisy there, that as these extremist groups use these free speech arguments, at the same time, they are using these tactics, these other tactics that we've talked about, to remove the free speech of their targets.
Yes.
So, and there is actually research that shows that free speech arguments are more often used to protect racist and discriminatory discourse than they are used to protect the speech of marginalized groups.
Right. That is precisely the point, Anjum, which is they're simultaneously attacking violently and through many of the mechanisms outlined above, indigenous and minority voices, exposing the hypocrisy of free speech. So for just doing this talk, I'm sure that we will be targeted, and there will be sites propping up saying that we are migrants threatening free speech in Aotearoa. These attacks are often carried out through astroturfs and influencers, often drawing on narratives such as accountability to taxpayers while laying claims to supporting free speech as a democratic value.
So let's move on. I think if we can skip quickly through
Yes.
the next couple of sections. So modes of communication. So text messages, which are generally just posts on websites. We have memes, which are photographs or a common image that people are familiar with from a TV show or a movie. And with commentary on the meme, and often, you know, like so in white supremacist spaces, they use Pepe the Frog or Pee Wee or so many others. Also, the use of videos, Photoshop videos. We're seeing particularly women, journalists, politicians, and activists photoshopped into pornographic videos as a mean to threaten and intimidate them. We also see the use of propaganda films, so films such as the Kashmir Files, the Kerala Story, and so on, in the Indian context. So using these as tools, as a way to reach mass audiences. Music is another one. So there's this whole genre of Hindutva pop that is freely available on YouTube that has lyrics that explicitly call for violence against Muslims and other minorities, that talk about creating rivers of blood and so on.
So, Anjum, can I add to that? So, in the last couple of years, we have seen increasing attacks on mosques that are carried out by Hindutva mobs, often supported by entities such as VHP or the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. Now, when these attacks are carried out, one of the things that you're seeing is how this music is played in the background. So as the mobs are coming, the music is being played loudly, and then they are organizing to start the attack.
And similarly, when the Christchurch mosque killer started his live stream, in the background was playing a Serbian nationalist song that is known as "Remove Kebab." That is, kebab is inferring Turkish communities and Muslim communities. So you can see the way that music is also used to propagate and inflame. Speeches.
So political actors have historically used speeches to call for direct violence. We have seen this historically in multiple instances where violent events and mobs have been catalyzed through political speeches. Now, digital platforms only have the opportunity to magnify these speeches manifold. So again, going back to India, we have the Haridwar Hate Assembly, where there were these saffron monks that were delivering hate speeches calling for murders of Muslims. But then those were picked up, videoed, and then circulated through WhatsApp and other platforms. So digital platforms really exacerbate and multiply manifold that hate through speech. And then that connects to mobs, which is that ultimately when you find these kinds of online warfare, they are materialized through mobs then that carry out the attack on a targeted person, a targeted group, a household, a community, or a neighborhood.
So the way this next section is talking about all the tools that are used to make this information go viral. So I think maybe if you do the first one, and I think we've covered the second one around the bully by
Yes.
and then I'll take it.
Yes. So swarm structures are the architectures of these platforms that are built to draw in large groups of people. So if you think about the algorithm that underlies the platform and what it gives visibility to, the platforms themselves are designed to build up swarms such that these swarms then come together to carry out the attack. So for the person or the community that is being attacked, the attack, like you pointed out, Anjum, feels in exponentially large volume that continues growing because of the capacity of the algorithm to build up these large groups that have come around a concept or an idea.
Yeah. And then the new hate platforms, so they're creating platforms that are specifically designed to push the hate. We have, you gave the example of the Bully By app. There's another example of a website I won't name that lists the names of people that should be tried and hung. for their participation in the COVID response. So these kinds of things. Then there are other techniques like astroturfing, where you have a concealed group or organization, or a political actor or party that is creating this impression of widespread, spontaneously arising grassroots movements in support of a particular topic. That where the reality is that it is organized activity by a particular group and not organic at all. Troll farms is where a lot of people are paid to act as trolls, and trolling is really about disrupting. So a paid person there to disrupt, to create a really hostile environment, to keep repeating points, to refuse to be persuaded, and to push hate viewpoints. And troll farms are used by a variety of states, to be using those and suspected to be. So Russia, India, Brazil, US, China, and many others. Automated bots. So you think you're talking to a person, that the account represents a real person, but they are just generating automated content. It is not even a human being that is there. So of course, they will never be persuaded. This is not, a marketplace of ideas happening. This is not fair and free debate. Sock puppets is another technique whereby one person will create multiple accounts. So you think that you're talking to, or that there are multiple different people that hold the same point of view, when in fact it's just one user who has created 10 or 15 or many more accounts, which gives them increased reach and increases the comment level of the post, which means it goes much more viral. And then did you want to just quickly cover anonymous accounts?
Anonymous accounts are fake or fictitious accounts that hide the identity of the real user to drive up hate and to drive up disinformation. Of course, when talking about this, Anjum, we discussed and recognize that often in authoritarian regimes, for instance, or amid censorship, anonymous accounts also offer protection for communities at the margins to be able to articulate viewpoint. So it's a fairly complex area to work around.
Yeah. So we can go to the next slide.
Yes.
Do you want to take the first few?
I'll just be really quick because we kind of covered this.
Yeah,
in terms of targets of online warfare, the point we want to make is that online warfare is directed at communities at the margins of the margins, and you see the diverse intersections that online warfare is directed at. The one point I wanted to add, Anjum, there is, in addition to communities, you see the continual targeting of activists, researchers, and academics, journalists, politicians. And then, as we see with the targeted attack on critical race theory based upon manufacturing of a whole lot of disinformation, for instance, that education curricula and public policies are also targeted.
So I'll quickly cover the types of platforms that are used to spread hate and used for online warfare. So we have websites that are owned by individuals or organizations, and I've given an example of one of those, but we also have websites such as WordPress or Substack that host content from other content creators. The whole area of gaming and gaming platforms have been used by extremists in multiple ways to promote their ideology, and the use of in-game chat functions to promote memes and other hateful content, as well as the creation of games. So we have multiple examples within Roblox and other sites where people have tried to create games from the point of view of the Christchurch killer and going around in the mosque and killing Muslims. So this kind of activity. Retail websites. I've separated this out because retail often gets overlooked because it's not social media. But retail is a space where, and you see this even on mainstream big retail platforms like Amazon and so on, where merchandise promoting hate ideology is sold. So it's a way of propagating hate, but also it's a way for them to fund their activities. So there's that twofold way of using retail websites, as well as, of course, they do have content in there from all the reviews. So that also is a space where hate can flourish and online warfare can flourish.
Anjum, can I just add something? So one of the things our research team has been evidencing with respect to retail websites is how retail content that is circulating hate paraphernalia is being sold alongside guns or infrastructures of violence, if you will. So there is that direct linkage with violence. A research team in India is pointing out that there are now multiple sites that are coming up that are basically sites for exchanging guns or selling guns at really cheap price, alongside this kind of content that is anti-Muslim.
Yeah, very much so. And just an interesting point to note that the DIA consultation on safer online services and media platforms currently seeks to exclude retail. And that's why I wanted to as well separate it out and say, yes, retail is incredibly important. Social media, I think mostly we're familiar with, so not needing to cover that. But it's your usual, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, all of those kinds of sites where you can network and share content. But we also see the use of platforms such as Telegram, Discourse, private Facebook pages, where extremists are organizing to move into more mainstream platforms.
And these messaging apps are particularly significant, Anjum, because of the nature of intimacy and interpersonal trust that they work upon to disseminate messages. I mean, WhatsApp within the context of India, you refer to the work of Professor Shakuntala Banerjee. It's really important that demonstrates that WhatsApp is one of the key infrastructures for disseminating Islamophobic hate in India.
Yeah, that's great.
Effects of online hate. Again,
yeah, let's go through these. So the violence aspect, we're seeing quite a bit of evidence of how online activity is connected to offline violence. So in the paper, we cover some examples. We certainly can't cover all of them. So for example, the influencer Andrew Tate, who is now facing charges of sexual trafficking and so on. And the general pickup artist culture, there's growing evidence that young men and boys are harassing teachers in the schoolroom, and that women are leaving the teaching profession because they simply have no tools and tactics to deal with this disruption in the classroom by people that have been inspired by these influences. Also have heard anecdotally stories of women who have been punched, hit, and know that their partners have been consuming this material. If you want to cover the Hindu part.
Yes. So in India, we have seen the ways in which Facebook posts, WhatsApp messages have been key to catalyzing violence, calling for violence, in very specific instances, for instance, putting up an image of someone and then doxing them and then asking people to come and attack that person. We have seen this carried out in the context of the lynchings that have targeted Muslims. And particularly salient here in these forms of violence is the direct linkage to the circulation of online violence. So in the recent incidences of violence that we witnessed in Nuh, in northern India, Anjum, what had happened is that VHP leaders were producing messages that were being circulated beforehand, particularly with coded messages calling for targeting of Muslims. So these platforms then become ways of coding messages that are hard for others outside of that community to read, that then are calling for action, like the time to act is now sort of thing.
Yeah. We've referred in the report to a really good report from Amnesty International documenting the role of Facebook in the Rohingya genocide, the way that virality worked, the way that Meta continued to not heed warnings that were given to them, and failed to enforce its own policies. And that ties into the fact that many of those platforms have wide reach in non-English speaking countries and have absolutely no moderation or very little moderation capacity and capability in those multiple languages.
So, Anjum, one of the things with respect to Meta is also worth noting that after all this activist pressure, Meta had commissioned a study on the effects of hate circulated on Meta. And yet, Meta is to release that study. It hasn't released the study, not even the summary of that study.
Yeah, interesting. And we give various other numerous examples within the paper as well of the impact of real life violence from online platforms.
Just quickly, there is ample empirical literature that documents the negative effects on health and well-being of individuals, groups, and communities that are targeted with online hate. There are significant effects on mental health of people that are targeted, and particularly critical here, the other side of it is the ways in which hate desensitizes, dehumanizes, and therefore mobilizes everyday people toward violent action.
Or if not mobilizing them, what you would expect as an outcry and an outrage response is absolutely missing because they have been desensitized, which therefore allows the extremist actors to continue in the violence that they perpetrate.
The next point, I had already covered it, but this is a really critical point, is voter suppression. There is again ample evidence of the ways in which online hate groups, white supremacist groups, working alongside sometimes foreign actors, target communities at the margins, manipulating them with messages such as "don't go out to vote," "what is the point to vote," with the idea then that the voting process itself reproduces white supremacist infrastructure.
Yeah, and then even the threat to democracies, we've seen state actors really active in other countries to try and disrupt elections and disrupt democratic processes.
Drivers of online.
Yeah, I think.
Shall we skip this?
I think we'll leave that and leave you to read about those in the paper.
Let's just go to some of the solutions that we envision.
You can start. Yep.
We divide up the solutions in terms of community processes, policy processes. So let's go to the first set of solutions that focus on the idea of empowerment, with the idea that given so much of disinformation and hate is directed precisely at silencing communities, equipping communities with the capacity to critically examine digital platforms, critically examine the workings of power, critically evaluate information and the quality of information. Building spaces for education and public education about quality websites. Like Anjum, you talked about the information about COVID-19, for instance. So what do you do when you look at a COVID-19 website? What are the kinds of things you look for to evaluate whether this is legitimate or not? Fact checkers, in India, for instance, Alt News is a very important platform for fact checking against Hindutva hate. In Aotearoa, you have Fight Against Conspiracy Theories. These are important resources for addressing that disinformation that circulates.
Yeah, and in fact, FACT, which is Fight Against Conspiracy Theories, did an excellent job in the last local body elections of researching candidates, showing where they had been involved in anti-vax activities or other kind of activities, because a lot of these people were hiding their involvement in groups like Voices for Freedom, which you would think if that's something they really believed that they would promote it, but no, they were hiding these things. And so exposing that and making sure that the voting public was aware of the full activities of their candidates was critically important.
And Anjum, here I really also want to tautoko the Disinformation Project, Anti-Fascist Aotearoa, as important sites for dissemination information and really countering a lot of that white supremacist hate and receiving hate as a result of that incredibly wonderful work there too.
And showing and explaining how and why this online hate is proliferating.
community mobilization. You want to touch upon that?
Yeah. So I really wanted to call out to Iwi Tautoko and Emily Beausoleil, who developed that program, which is a way of mobilizing communities to speak back to online hate, particularly focused on hate towards Māori. Ourselves at Inclusive Aotearoa are trying to build at the formative stages of building a group that focuses on better digital policy. And of course, there's the work of CARE. So those community mobilization spaces are really critically important, that they are supported and resourced to deal with some of these issues.
Yeah, and one of the examples there that is quite powerful, and Tina, when she was an activist in residence here, and Tiano, who spoke with you, Anjum, with the Solidarity Project in one of our earliest activist interventions, highlighted is this importance of solidarity between Maori, Pacifica, migrant communities, for instance, finding connections that become a way for challenging the divisiveness fostered by hate.
And then also part of empowerment is making sure that there is not just representation from these marginalized groups in decision making, in the spaces where code is developed, in the spaces where policy is developed, but that lived experience of having to receive this stuff, of having to try and report it, of the failures to get state mechanisms to address and provide justice. Those kinds of perspectives are critically important all through the stack for technology, all through the public service. This is a critical technique.
And one of the things, Anjum, your work, really speaks to, and I remember that, that 7-part series that you and Alia did, that pointed to is how often the voices of Muslim women activists were unheard throughout the Crown infrastructures. And that points to this need of building listening spaces.
And in fact, we were accused of just being there to try and get money. And just not believed because we didn't have the empirical evidence, because of course we didn't have the resourcing. And that's how it is with marginalized communities, that you can't bring the evidence base, but you know what you know and what you see and all the things that are being reported to you from your community, plus what you yourself experience. And yet it was never enough.
The next set of solutions, we realize and we recognize that we speak as Tawiwi, of course, coming from post-colonial context, having grappled with histories of colonization, but we speak as Tawiwi, but we see the fundamental importance of connecting with Te Tiriti, connecting with Tangata Whenua struggles, and really looking at questions of data, disinformation, with questions of land rights, for instance, and recognizing that one of the fundamental forms of disinformation was itself the colonial project that shaped and constructed colonized peoples as primitive to justify the colonizing process. So that work needs to continue on an ongoing basis.
And the fact that all of our institutions and structures, including our parliamentary structures, our local government structures, are all based on colonial frameworks and a single viewpoint ideology, and the whole one law for all mentality, and that what's good for the majority population is good for everyone. These issues of cost efficiency and so on, and quick results, all are built into these systems that really actively harm Indigenous groups and other marginalized
and
groups.
then I guess, Anjum, connected to this is the colonial deployment of disinformation to steal land, right? Which is why any struggle against disinformation has to recognize struggles for land rights and struggles against incarceration, noticing again that the project of slavery is based upon fundamental disinformation. This then connects to questions of data sovereignty. How do Indigenous communities, local communities across the global south enact sovereignty over the data that is taken from communities and turned into resources for extraction and exploitation? Data sharing, particularly in terms of how do we build the commons and public open spaces where data can be worked through by communities at the margins toward justice. So the challenge that you were saying, that how can that research actually be supportive of communities that are experiencing the hate, right?
Yeah.
To drive policies.
But also within that data sharing space is the way that tech platforms are hiding behind commercial sensitivity and intellectual property and so on. So there is absolutely no access provided to the reams and reams of data that they have that would show the harm that their platforms are causing. And so often the only way we get a bit of insight into this is whistleblowers like we had with Facebook and Meta last year. But the ability of researchers to access this data and then to be able to publish publicly their findings is critical here.
Right. And decolonizing free speech, and this needs to be an ongoing conversation. As someone of Indian origin, I can say, I mean, you think about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the Rowlatt Act, and that actually worked to silence the freedom of presses, dissenting presses that question the colony. So historically, the project of freedom and democracy constituted within the colonial architecture has worked one way for the crown, one way for the empire, and another way for the colonized people. And we need to continue to point this out and then think through that in terms of what decolonization looks like.
I'll move to accountability processes. So we know, and in the section that we haven't talked about, we have mentioned the way that algorithms work, the recommender algorithms and other types of, there are content moderation algorithms and various other automated processes as well as machine learning processes. So as you click your likes or as you click websites from your Google search or your Bing search or whatever, the machine is learning what you like, what content you're likely to click on, and serving you more and more of that, thereby creating a bubble for you. So all of these algorithmic processes and machine learning processes are happening. And we believe that there should be an infrastructure around the impact of these algorithms. And the Christchurch Call is currently doing some significant research projects around algorithms. And I have also previously written a paper for Internet New Zealand showing how the infrastructure for financial audits could translate over to an infrastructure for algorithmic audits. We're asking that national security strategies are put in place to deal with some of the stuff, especially because it is states trying to disrupt other states. So therefore, the states on the receiving end must have resourced, connected strategies to counter and prevent the effectiveness of the disruption that's being caused.
Anjum, I have a question with regard to this. Given the settler colonial history of Aotearoa, and given the research that is currently pointing out that, for instance, white supremacists are infiltrating security, police, and agencies, what are the kinds of... I think that this challenge is also quite complex in terms of the kinds of checks and bounds you put into this.
Oh, absolutely. And so if you had seen or would like to see my public lecture, the videos on the Kia website, I've talked about the Royal Commission recommendations and what they've recommended, not only around social cohesion, but around the way the public service does their community engagement and the ISO standards around public participation. And we're saying they need to go beyond that. So any strategy has to be co-designed. The Royal Commission also talked about classification of data and ensuring that everything is made more transparent. They asked for national security priorities to be made public where they hadn't before. So transparency here, having diverse perspectives in the room and a whole lot of lived experience in the room, and independent complaints mechanisms, and publishing what is going on and how these strategies are being used. I know that in the national security space there is some need for secrecy, but really in order to have that community mobilization, we really do need to know and understand what is going on. So this strategy has to be seen as a community partnership. Mm-hmm. That's the only way that decolonization is going to happen, as well as co-governance procedures in place or structures in place. Platform regulation. So you can't regulate away all of these problems, but also you can't have no regulation. So regulation has to be part of the suite of measures that are available. And certainly overseas countries have put in place legislation that provide regulatory infrastructure. So for example, the European Union's Digital Safety Act, the Australia's Online Safety Act, Ireland's Online Safety and Media Regulation Act. The UK is still working its way through their online safety bill, while here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we've just finished another consultation and there is no even draft legislation in sight at this stage, and we've got an election in between all of this happening. Most of these acts are either 2022 or 2023, so we don't yet know how effective they are and won't know for at least another decade. Product liability. I think that there is scope. This is a very dangerous area and would hit new platforms really hard, but I think there is a space for holding these platforms liable for what they publish. Normally, and in most states, it is the content creator who's liable, not the platform, but the way that platform algorithms work to make things viral, the way that they promote outrage and so on, I think there is a space for liability to be there. We've talked about resourcing, because a lot of this, like, so the community mobilization, the regulatory systems, the sheer volume of content that we're dealing with, the systemic issues, the algorithms, putting up an algorithm audit infrastructure, all of this costs massive amounts of money. And we put forward the view that actually if these big multinational platforms paid their fair share of taxes in all the countries that they're extracting wealth from, that would be more than enough to resource all of this. I know we've gone well over time, so I'll just quickly touch on, in terms of taxonomies and definitions, still a lot of these terms, terrorists, violent extremists, and so on, are contested terms. And so there has been a lot of work done around this. And, you know, we need real clarity about what's illegal, what's harmful but not illegal, what is not at all harmful, you just don't like that someone's criticizing you, all of these kinds of things. And when we're thinking about regulatory frameworks, always bearing in mind that what if a hostile or extremist actor takes control of government and are applying those regulatory regimes, because what we know is most often the regimes are used against marginalized communities rather than used to protect them.
Yeah. And I just wanted to give one example, Anjum, and this is why the complexity, I guess, and nuance are really so important, and context, like you point out earlier, because, you know, in case other work in Singapore, for instance, you know, working with activists there, mobilizing against the Prevention of Online Falsehoods Act, POFMA, which is deployed by the state to silence activists. There you see that how disinformation is framed by the state in order to silence critical voices or limit the space for critical voices. I think working through that nuance, as you point out, is really critical.
Yeah, yeah. And then
with the Trump test.
Yeah.
We have time.
Yeah. And so finally is the importance of collaborative processes, because for a lot of these platforms, they are way bigger than the state of New Zealand. They're way bigger than many states. And they operate internationally. And we've seen, for example, the stoush that Australia had with Meta, which resulted in Meta shutting down access to legitimate media platforms and so on, that their power over some states is quite considerable. And having international consensus and international agreement around this issue, and working in a multi-stakeholder way to work with platforms, with governments, and critically with civil society is really important. And so I've given examples of some of those international collaborative organizations. And one of the ideas that I've put forward recently is about using UN processes. So, for example, with Christchurch Core, both governments and platforms have signed up to various commitments. And certainly governments, it's difficult for individual governments to hold each other to account, particularly when you're living in a space of free trade agreements and aid packages and so on. So using processes like the Universal Periodic Review, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination, all forms of discrimination against women, and various other UN processes that require countries to report every 5 years, that require a civil society report as well as a country report, and that gives space for other countries to call out the progress or the lack of progress of countries, would be a way to hold countries accountable for the commitments that they have their names on, and they get benefit from, of saying, yes, we are signatories to this, when often they may well be contravening those commitments, for example, to a free, open and secure internet by internet shutdowns and various other things.
And, we started with the process of empowering communities, and we are now moving into policy and international collaborations. One of the things that we also propose is developing a hate index. A hate index is something that can be developed through community partnerships, through the participation of communities at the margins, in being able to actually create metrics for measuring businesses, for measuring platforms, for measuring organizations on their participation in hate, and counter that, their participation in promoting SDG 19, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And this can be a critical mechanism if done well, with rigor, validated across contexts, and then mapped globally to address the ways in which businesses and organizations are contributing to hate, and then work toward sustainable futures where we have peace and justice. Connected to that, Anjum, I can also see, with us pointing to all these UN processes, just being the target of these fresh round of conspiracies around the sustainable development agenda in UN processes and UN takeover, which is sort of this narrative of a communist takeover through UN processes. And I think this is a great example of the way in which you see disinformation is being mobilized, but also an opportunity for collaborative spaces to address that kind of disinformation.
Yeah.
So with that, we will wrap up. We talked about online warfare, what it is, what its communicative modes are, what are its effects, and then some strategies for looking at solutions.
So yeah, that's the end of this. Once this white paper is published, I really hope that you will take the time to go through it. There's a lot of links as well to other source material, but this is part of that solution around education, of making people aware of what it looks like, how it works, what its impacts are, and what we need to be doing in order to solve these problems. And I have to say that the issue is absolutely urgent. This is not something that we can think about later. The harm is happening right now. People are being killed, they're being harmed, as well as the psychological harm. This is all current, and it's overdue.
Kia ora. Thank you. We'll open up to questions.
You want that switched off? Recorded? I am not doing recorded particularly.
Okay.
You are the presenters. I'm just an audience, one person audience. Yeah, if it's switched off, I don't mind either way.
Because we have online audience joining in.
Oh, I
so
see. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's
Yeah, I have one comment and one question. The question is, what was the Trump test? I thought we missed that.
So the Trump test was when I was talking about where you have hostile actors that get into government. And so, for example, his discourse around all Mexicans being rapists, and around Muslims, around disabled people, and mocking them, all sorts of things. And then having someone like that having access to the machinery of government as in the position of president and being able to issue presidential orders, but able to mobilize the security of the state if there are not active checks and balances built into the system. So therefore, I often say that whatever regulation that you're putting in place, you should put through this test to ensure that that a hostile political actor in power of state machinery is not able to abuse that regulation.
What is the test? How do you test it?
Well, that depends on the policy.
Oh.
Like it's not a universal, oh, you do this one thing. It would depend on the policy and the solution that you're looking at and how can you protect it. And so, for example, if we look at the Classifications Office, it has is protected by statutory independence, right? So it is protected from political interference and state interference, cannot be interfered with. And so if you look at the Broadcasting Standards Authority, the publishing of all of its decisions publicly available, all of its reasoning put through publicly available. So these are some of the mechanisms, an adequate complaints procedure. Again, these are things I talked about yesterday in the public lecture. These are mechanisms that we can put in place to build the robustness of the system so that it cannot be misused by malicious political actors.
And also, I guess, in that context, really specifying the nature of the policy. So let me give you an example. So let's take the Human Rights Act and the context of racism, right? As Anjum was pointing out, that when Minister Marama Davidson talked about cis white men being the sources of violence, that got one of the largest set of complaints. Now, the test there is that mechanism should be able to take a look at those complaints and say these are spurious complaints that are coming from white supremacists that don't want to be challenged.
No, it's about having the capacity and knowledge and ability to discern within the regulator, which in that case was the Human Rights Commission.
When you're testing something, you're examining it with something that whether these things apply. That is what I understand by test. So this white supremacist thing brought out, you said these are the criteria that we apply to see if it's actually true or not.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, exactly. So that basically precisely that. So specifying that context so that the policy is responsive to that context, right, don't you?
Yeah. Are there any other
And
questions?
my comment is that you seem to be using the phrase at the margin and the word marginalized interchangeably. I have an objection there. When you talk about marginalized passive voice, it means somebody else is responsible for it. Like Maori colonization process, ethnic people like us, ethnic people are being, this is okay. The contested and understood. There's a lot of white people here using that not sort of pejoratively but descriptively, who are at the margin, not marginalized by anybody necessarily, but they're at the margin, meaning in the socio-economic lower strata of people, which is they themselves refer to themselves as white trash. The Maori are the ethnic trash. We don't like to see them here, although it is their country, it was also a country. We are the white trash. Now they seem to be being left out of this discourse.
So that,
They're being targeted in various ways, they're suffering, and so on. And very often they are inspired and encouraged to go against the marginalized, colonialized people.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, so I have a response to that actually. So the concept so it's a very theoretical concept with the culture-centered approach. The concept margins of the margins recognizes that there are diverse intersections. So there is interplay of class, race, ethnicity, gender. Those intersections play out. And absolutely, in our work on poverty, for instance, we see that there are working class poor who are white and who experience these challenges. And so the response to that from this perspective would be that social cohesion solutions or structural solutions need to address the needs of people negotiating poverty broadly, and that's a class challenge. Having said that, that's why intersectionality, that the racialized nature of capital also means that for Maori, historically, that uh, uh, class marginalization is further exacerbated by the colonial processes. Or one might say, with African Americans in the US, the history of slavery and ongoing racism further exacerbates that class marginalization. So, within the context of this paper, then, what this means is that, particularly for white working class communities that are often the targets of disinformation, the solutions we offered with critical literacy, building habits of education, learning how to discern information, those are critical tools, because the challenge for those communities is not people of color, it's not indigenous people, but it is actually the policy infrastructure that is marginalized. But to do that, you will need to build critical literacy so that communities are able to evaluate that.
And can I just add that colonialist structures are very good at pitting marginalized communities against each other.
The divide and rule.
So that is also at play in all of this online warfare space.
I would suggest that in your own activities in the community or in these kinds of forums, you try to draw those so-called white trash into it. So they realize, they understand that the struggle is not just for the Maori and the visible ethnic people, but them also.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the work of Inclusive Aotearoa is precisely in doing that kind of pedagogy, and same with the work of CARE.
We don't just look at one basis of, like, we don't just look at racism, we look at all forms of diversity. So absolutely that is integral to our work.
We've got a question online, Professor Anjum. We've got a question from Kafir Answer. How can structural Islamophobia be countered that has been inserted within academic texts of young children?
Yeah, that is really difficult. I think, there are several approaches. So there's a complaints process in using the Ministry of Education and going right to the ministry level, using complaints processes within the school. So going to the Board of Governors, the Board of Trustees, and the principal. And then there's community education practices. So asking for the opportunity, if you yourself have the capacity and time, or if there's somebody else within your community, to be able to present to the classroom. So, I mean, it's not a simple task. And then there's the level of approaching teacher training colleges, continuing professional development for teachers, and using those mechanisms to teach educators around some of these issues that they might not be familiar with around structural Islamophobia.
And I guess, Anjum, the other part of it is that, Kaifia, hi, lovely to have you on Facebook. And thanks for joining us. I think part of the challenge also is, what do you do when you have state actors, hostile state actors that are pushing an Islamophobic ideology? I mean, you think about Hindutva right now, that is rewriting the textbooks in India and rewriting history to make it explicitly Islamophobic, or you think about the targeted reactionary attacks on textbooks across the US from white supremacists and from the far right, again, now elected into policy structures, school boards, and things like that,
And I always remember hearing stories from the Soviet Union where there was, a very strong suppression of religion, and the ways that people had to navigate that is really quite illuminating. So that when that structure fell, they had still held on to some things. Not a whole lot of things, but at least they still knew their identity. They knew there was Quran and this and that. So depending on where you're at and the level it is, the ways to disrupt power is, often dangerous. It's often heartbreaking, but very necessary.
And also sustained in community, in the
Yes.
spaces of relationships and love and connection and nurturing and sustenance.
Yeah, and so that's the question. Can you talk to other parents who are maybe not Muslim parents? How can you build and organize support? Because that is that's why we have collective in our name, because we recognize the power of working together to withstand some of these structural issues.
I want to ask you a question, Anjum, as we wrap up. I want to pick up on that question that Srikantoda asked, which is there is ample empirical evidence in terms of the ways in which dominant neoliberal structures, so these are powerful corporate entities, are seeding this hate, often targeting white working class communities to produce the migrant or the Black communities or here Maori as the threat, so that they can continue with further privatization, accumulation of resources, and extractive policies. Recognizing that, what are the ways in which one builds dialogue? We talk about dialogue. In one piece I wrote that became quite a piece of contention. I said that we should not dialogue with the sources of misinformation because there is no dialogue there. But when you think about communities that are at the margins, that are economically struggling and are the targets of disinformation based upon othering, how do you build that space for dialogue, which seems so vital to building and sustaining democracy?
Yeah, it's really difficult because, what you find is the people that most need to hear this kind of discourse and that most need to have some education around what's going on are the people that are least likely to turn up. There's the whole issue of the digital divide, so not having access to devices, not having access to connectivity, not having the money to buy unlimited data and minutes and so on, or to have devices, not having the digital literacy to be able to access, right? So there's all of the online barriers as well as the offline barriers of holding down 3 jobs, of addictions to cope with pressures around poverty and mental health and so many other things. And that isolation is definitely a tactic that extremists use to isolate. They're similar to family violence, to isolate people from their families, from their friends, from trusted sources, not believing government, not believing media, all of these things.
Not believe in academia and universities,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Notwithstanding that each of these institutions have huge issues, and we've talked about colonial, but even so. So I think this is where the challenge is how do you start accessing or getting access to those communities? And it really is one thing is about going to where they are, right, and finding the spaces where they are. Secondly, critically important is around building those relationships of trust, because that's, again, what extremists are very good at doing, and particularly in the online warfare space, that they're using very, very sophisticated, latest technology, latest science methods of capturing and engaging people and keeping them there. Right? And so they know very quickly how to build that relationship of trust. So the techniques we see, for example, of initially presenting information that is absolutely verifiable, and so on, and real and valid concerns. And so when someone goes to check that out, they're like, oh, yes, this is all true. It's verified, I found. And so then they start seeding a few bits of disinformation into the still a lot of valid information. And so that trust then goes to, well, they were right about that. And you stop fact checking them because they were right about that. I checked that. So they must be right about this as well. Right? Offline relationships also critically important. That ability to awhi, to show care and respect, knowing that they have views that are very problematic, and then having the resilience, because what I know, like we do a lot of training and so on, is going into these spaces, you're going to hear all the stereotypical, all the harmful tropes that they've picked up online. And that can be triggering for people that have had to deal with that their whole lives and have suffered real harm from those things. So building that resilience around it, which is why I talked about the resourcing. It takes time, it takes care. People are falling down and getting radicalized within 2 to 3 months, whereas it can take years to try and pull them out of that.
Right. And I want to wrap up with this idea of resourcing, because I think I see a couple of things going on here. Anjum, on one hand, there are these far right attacks on critical literacy, on critical education, simply because I guess, for the far right, if you think about its extremist agenda, doesn't want people and communities to be critically aware, to be critically engaged, because then communities would be asking the critical questions of our politicians and policymakers about allocation of resources, about public welfare and the ways in which public welfare is accessible, those kinds of things.
And about capitalism itself.
Yes. And then there is the other side of it, which is sort of this kind of neoliberal attack on institutions that has fundamentally depleted schools, tertiary education, based upon a model that has made it more and more difficult for communities, particularly communities at the margins, working class communities, to come in and get in an education. So on one hand, we can say there is a growth in anti-intellectualism, but on the other hand, that has been orchestrated by neoliberal policies that have made universities and education inaccessible, the same way in which community education has been made inaccessible, right? Because you need the resources, the funding, the infrastructure to sustain doing that work of going out into the community and educating people and working alongside them.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. It is what I think the term these days is a wicked problem. It's definitely one of those. But I feel like you try and keep the hope. It's very important to keep the hope. And, you see human beings being resilient. I talked about the Soviet Union and so on, through the worst of things and coming through. And I think, from a personal faith perspective, that it is always our responsibility to keep trying, regardless of whether we see the fruits of our labor. And I always believe that we don't always see the fruits. Often what we're doing is planting a seed. We may never see it flower, but we've got to keep planting in the hopes that somewhere a shoot will come through. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Anjum. It's been a pleasure having you with us this week.
Oh, thank you.
We have learned so much. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Hope you will come back to these lectures and these conversations. I'm sure you will. And when the paper is ready, we will put it up on the CARE website. So keep an eye out for it. Namaste.